This is Brian Godhard. Today I am talking with him. This is Linda Eastburn of Linda Eastburn YouTube channel, and he is a researcher and investigator at Cryptid Paranormal. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And tell me, how did you first become interested in the whole cryptid phenomenon?
I've been interested as far back as I can remember. I'm pretty sure I saw something on Unsolved Mysteries in the 80s that opened the door wide open for the interest. And then from there, I checked books out of the school library, watched documentaries, specials, all any kind of cryptid or any kind of paranormal show that was on. I was all over it. And then later in the late 90s, I had an encounter with a Sasquatch myself. And that's kind of took off from there. Really affirm I was already interested, but that pretty much cemented it in stone.
Well, yeah, I would think an encounter would do that for sure. Lots of people that I talked to, that was the thing that got them into this. It was early interest, perhaps, but then an encounter actually, really sealed the deal. So tell me about this encounter in the 90s. How old were you? Where were you when you saw this? And how did you respond to it?
I was about 16, and my best friend and I were playing paintball. We grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, but my parents had 11 and a half acres of property in Pennsylvania that we used to camp at. And, um, it was somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight. And we've been playing paintball all weekend, but for whatever reason, we decided it would be a great idea to try to play at night, maybe duct tape some laser pointers to the gun, help us find each other a little bit. So we were shooting at each other in the woods and running around. And I saw what I thought was him. So I had come around I thought I was coming around behind him and I was going to come up. Then I had a big grin on my face because I thought I was going to drop on him and nail him. And so I got into position and I started shooting, and he didn't react, not at first. And then I moved in a couple steps, got a little closer, and started shooting again. And then whatever it was, which I've come to believe is a Sasquatch, but this thing stood up straight, and I am 6 foot 8 inches tall. I was at that time this tall, and it towered over me easily 2 or 3 feet. It was massive. I've never seen anything like it before in my life. Scared the hell out of me. I took off running down the trail.
So when you first saw this, you could tell it was some kind of a living being. Could you tell that when you first saw it?
Well, I saw it looked like it was moving a little bit, but it was hunched over. I'm not sure what it was doing. So I thought it was my friend PJ because I saw it move. But it was so dark, and I just figured who else would be out there. The properties surrounding where my parents' place is some of the farms are several hundred acres. There's never in all the years we've never run into anybody else out there. You know what I mean? So I just assumed it was him because it was moving, and I could see that it was bent over. I thought he was getting the position to try to ambush me.
Could
And
you
then when
tell? Could you tell when he stood up? Obviously, the massive quantity of the size had an impact on you, but could you tell anything else? Was he facing you, or was his back facing you? How were you seeing him?
I believe it was kind of the right side of his back. I mean, once it stood up, it eventually turns towards me. And as it was standing up, my first instinct was maybe it was a bear, but then it was towering over me. And then once I saw it stand up, how big it was, and the fact that it was standing on two legs, I knew it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't human. And at the time, it never occurred to me that I would actually run into one, so out there anyways. And I had no idea what it was, so I just reacted on instinct and took off running. And my friend PJ was on another trail. The two trails intersect at a point. As it turns out, he was shooting at the same thing. and he thought it was me trying to ambush him, and he thought he was getting the drop on me. And he saw it because it had turned to look at me, and then it turned to look at him. And when it looked at him, he realized it wasn't me. And he's probably 6'3". We're still best friends till today. We talk about this all the time. But he's a bigger guy. He was probably around 300 pounds at that time. And when the two of us intersected in the trail, because he almost plowed me over running back towards the camper, and we both stopped and looked, and we saw this thing had walked towards us and was kind of staring at us for a second. And we both looked at each other and were like, what the hell's going on? This thing was huge. And we took off running as fast as we could back into the camper.
So you were camping out for that time period out at this, what did you say, 11 acres that your parents owned?
Yeah, 11 and a half. Yeah. They had
11.
an old trailer that they had on there that we would stay in, we would camp in.
So how many days were you there on that land at that time?
We'd probably gone up on a Friday afternoon, and this would have been a Saturday night.
Did you go ahead and stay that night and stay on the property for a while?
Oh yeah, we stayed the night. I mean, my parents were out cold, and neither one of us had our driver's licenses yet, so we weren't going anywhere. And frankly, we weren't sure. We sat up all night trying to figure out what actually happened. What did we really see? Because we're both going back and forth, and we're both interested in cryptids and things of that nature, but we never expected to see a Sasquatch there. And the fact that the way we encountered it, it just scared the hell out of us because it stood up, it walked on two legs, it was bipedal. It didn't, if it was a bear, for example, it would have had to fall at some point on its other legs. It never did. And it was moving very quickly, but it didn't appear to be running. It was just walking, probably because its steps were massive.
And this
And
is the only time that you've ever seen one on that property? Was
that's the only time. And we sat up pretty much all night talking about it, trying to figure out, running through every scenario. And then the next morning, when it was light out, we kind of slowly creeped our way back over there. First, we looked out the back windows. Then we went kind of in the back behind where the trailer was and looked over. There's a little bit of a hill. So we kind of, crawled our way up. We were kind of suspicious, make sure I was still there. And we, kind of retraced each of our steps the next day and figured out kind of where the thing was. And we had both agreed what we saw, that it had to be a Sasquatch. There was no other explanation for something that massive walking on two legs. Not to mention, since we were both shooting paintballs at it, if it was any kind of bear or any other predator, it probably would have attacked us. But whatever it was did come towards us to some extent. But I think it realized we were probably more scared of it than it was of us. And honestly, I'm not even sure if it was scared of us at all. It didn't seem like it seemed like it barely noticed the paintballs, almost like it was like a fly landing on it. So I don't think it found us threatening because it stopped and then we took off and it didn't pursue us because it could have caught us if it wanted to.
exactly. So, since then, have you researched if there have been any other Bigfoot sightings near that area?
There were at that time in the 90s. So where they're located is the first exit in Pennsylvania over the Ohio line. And during that kind of the mid late 90s time period in Ashtabula County, which was the Ohio side essentially of where their place is, there was a lot of sightings during that time. Ashtabula was not yet developed. It's only been built up in the last 5 or 10 years, really. So it was very wooded. There's a lot of streams. The lake is not too far. There's rivers going through there. A lot of bodies of water. It's very thick wilderness. The Pennsylvania side still isn't developed. It's still as rural as it was. It still is that rural today as it was 25 years ago. It hasn't changed a bit. And during that time, there was a lot of sightings around that area. So I would imagine because it was so dense at that time, because there was so many water sources and things like that, and there was probably plenty of food and places for them to hide, that they were at least at that time were in that area.
Did your friend go ahead and start researching, doing investigations too, or is that just something that you did on your own?
That's more of a me thing. He's interested in it. We always talk about it all the time. He'll watch the documentaries and stuff with me, but I go looking. I've been looking. I go to West Virginia. I've been to Hocking Hills in Ohio, where there's a lot of sightings down there and things like that. Salt Fork State Park. I'm actively looking for him. I want to see more. I want this time. Now that I understand what I saw, if I saw it again, I would react differently.
How would
But,
you react differently? What would you do?
I wouldn't run for sure. And now when I go out looking for them, I always have some kind of camera on my body recording everything I come across. So even if I wear a body camera, or at night I have night vision goggles that record, so that it picks up everything I see or anything I encounter. Even if I miss it, I can review the footage later just in case I miss something when I was actually looking. But I'm out there actively looking, trying to find proof that these things are out there and they are real.
So how did cryptid paranormal come about?
I've always been interested in the paranormal as a whole, not just cryptids, but also the supernatural, extraterrestrials, UFOs, things of that nature. And over the years of just researching and talking to people, going to events, things like that, I started to become not convinced, but started to form a belief that perhaps some of this is all connected. I don't believe in the supernatural as a magic or anything like that. I think there's a logical explanation. I think there's a scientific explanation that perhaps we just don't have the answer to yet. But I think the answers are out there if we look for them and investigate them. So I branched off into ghosts, everything along that line, other cryptids, Mothman, Dogman, the sheep squatch in West Virginia, the goat man in Maryland and Kentucky and things like that. And it just kind of all branched out. And then that's how I ended up creating cryptid paranormal, because it just kind of combines the two elements. Because cryptids are, a lot of people would say that cryptids are paranormal, which some people think that they are supernatural, that they can perhaps disappear, or they can travel through portals, or they're not corporeal at all. There's some kind of spirit or things like that. So I just kind of started compiling everything together and doing my research. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not convinced that, I don't believe that they're a spirit. I think they're corporeal, they're biological, and they may understand things about this world that we do not, but I don't think that they're using any kind of supernatural powers to disappear or travel around us, if that makes sense.
Did that sighting that yeah, first sighting that you had, did it show any evidence of anything paranormal about it?
No, in my opinion, it didn't. It didn't disappear. We ran. So I have no idea what happened to it. I didn't see what direction it went. And the next day, when we went back out there, we couldn't find any signs of it. And, it was roughly early fall. So they hadn't really been raining. So the woods were not particularly wet or muddy or anything like that. So the ground was still relatively hard. I mean, now if I were to do it, I would go look for hair samples. I would take a magnifying glass to the area. I'd look all over the place. Back then, we were just two dumb kids walking around like, okay, I think it was standing here. Which way do you think it went? I'm like, I'm not sure if I want to know which way it went.
Right,
You
exactly. A
know?
whole different response than you would have today. So
Yeah.
let me ask you, from that experience, that kind of flesh and blood sort of Bigfoot in the woods sort of sighting that you had, and then you move to, like these paranormal possibilities and the connection. What is the thread that you're seeing through all of these kind of cryptid environments and ghost environments and things of that nature?
The For example, a documentary on YouTube called Sasquatch, and that came out in 2017. There's a tribe in Canada, the First Nations people, that believe it's a spiritual being. They don't believe it's corporeal at all. They think it moves in between our world and whatever comes next. And if you go through Native American folklore throughout North America, you see a lot of similarities. The description is all the same. And a lot of them describe them as being some kind of otherworldly being, whether it be a spirit, or sometimes they're described more as guardians, perhaps, of the wilderness. Some of the tribes, in their oral history, they talk about how they used to live side by side with them, but humans started basically not living with the environment and with the world. We started retrofitting the environment to fit our own needs, and then they kind of moved away and they went somewhere else. They didn't want anything to do with that. They thought it was wrong in some of the mythology of the Native American population. And it's interesting because there are tribes in Northern California, there are tribes in Washington, there's legends even here in Ohio, there's stuff in British Columbia, there's stuff in Alaska, and some of this stuff goes back hundreds of years through their oral history. And more than likely at that time, all these people probably would not have been able to communicate. They're thousands of miles apart, and there were no roads, no trails at that time. It's unlikely that they ever would have had any connection. But they all have come to the same conclusion, and it's the same description. They talk about something that's anywhere from 7 to 9 feet tall. It's hairy, it's bipedal, it's mysterious, it's seen, but it's not necessarily aggressive. However, there's another side of it too, when you start to get to where Alaska, and there are some of the Native American tribes in California describe it as, and British Columbia for that matter, describe it as aggressive. There's two different thoughts there. So, but it's all the same thing. It's all some kind of guardian or some kind of spiritual being. And a lot of the legends say that it can come and go as it wants through some kind of portal. Now, whether that's a physical portal or there's some kind of cave system that we're completely unaware of, or perhaps there is some kind of natural portal or means of disappearing that we simply don't understand, or we forgot as our ancestors evolved and used technology and stopped accepting things that couldn't necessarily be explained.
Why do you think the Native Americans tended to be able to see and understand them as living between two worlds, and some people who have sightings also have those experiences, and other people do not? What do you think the difference is between the people that just see flesh and blood, believe it's totally flesh and blood, and those who have that experience as something between worlds with Bigfoot?
I think it depends on partly on where you are. I think it depends on how long you're paying attention to it. I think some people simply remain calmer if the encounter lasts longer. So perhaps they see it go somewhere, as opposed to people who have the reaction that my friend and I had when we were 16, where you see this thing and you're like, getting the hell out of here. So I think that's part of it. I think if there is in fact a cave system, or really some kind of portal system that really does exist that we don't understand, that perhaps people who have those encounters are simply in the right place at the right time. In some of the Native American and First Nations folklore, a lot of times the Sasquatches are seen near certain rock faces or certain parts of the forest where they believe have mystical qualities, that things can disappear there. So if that is if there really is some kind of portal system like that, perhaps that's why some people are seeing that, is because they're catching the Sasquatch as they're going to wherever it is they go, and the others do not. Um, some people, I think sometimes the experience of seeing something can be so overwhelming. I think some people just don't know how to process what they saw. I think if you talk to people years later, as opposed to right after the fact, you might find out they have more details and remember things differently than the initial encounter, just simply having time to process it. And more than likely, if you are like me, where you start to research it and start to realize, well, hey, I'm not alone in this. Other people have seen this, And then, I think you kind of look back and you say, well, what did I actually see? And there are things that maybe at the time you would have dismissed as that's not possible, I'm not even entertaining that, and then switched over to, now that I know other people have seen this, I'm not crazy and there's all this history behind it. Maybe I did see it disappear, and I think that's the kind of balancing act sometimes people are playing. And like I said, sometimes I think it's just right place at right time.
Exactly. One of the discussions I've had with people before with the cloaking idea and the idea that they can just go into a different dimension or something, is the Patterson Gimlin film, Patty. It's like, well, she's obviously running, seems a little nervous, scared. Why didn't she just, pour it up into another dimension? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think, if that's in fact what they're doing, is traveling to somewhere else, whether it be somewhere else on Earth, another dimension, plane of existence, whatever the case may be, I don't think it's something that they can just do out of force of will. I think that they're utilizing something that exists, whether it exists naturally or something else put it here long before humans came along. I don't know what the answer to that is. Um, if that's in fact what they're doing, then I think that's they're going through portals, and that's probably why Patty didn't just disappear. I don't think she could have. I think she would have had to go somewhere to take this portal, or if it's just a cave system or some kind of hidden cave system that they access somehow, I think she would have had to go to that area. And, I don't know, from what they got in the Gimlet film, who knows how far she was, where she was going, where she went. She may have very well been on her way to something to disappear. She may have just come out of something. Perhaps she didn't want to lead those guys back to wherever she came from. Sometimes people see more than one, so it's possible they travel in groups. It's possible they migrate. So any more than likely, if they're traveling in groups and if they're as smart as we think they are, it probably would not lead humans back to the others, because whatever reason, it does seem like they want to stay away from us.
Exactly. It kind of reminds me of what you're talking about is, a portal or a space whereby these kind of interdimensional worlds can collide or come together where they might be able to come and go. Reminds me of the show Outlander. If anyone who's seen that, where there is a place where these rituals have occurred, and by going to that place, then they can port into other time frames.
I I would not be surprised if something either naturally exists, or if something else puts something in place that the Sasquatches have learned to use. Perhaps our ancestors did too, and it just became forgotten knowledge, or perhaps we never knew about it, but the Sasquatches figured it out somehow. It does
Exactly.
seem like that they are intelligent from what we've observed.
It does, and it seems as if there's a lot of mixed messages out there in the Bigfoot world. I don't really have a set opinion about it, but I'm open-minded about all of the experiences that people have had, and it does seem like it's divided based on the people who have just simply a pure flesh and blood type of experience with these creatures, and other people have these somewhat different sort of paranormal, where footprints are being set down beside them as they walk, but there's no visual image of a Bigfoot. Sounds that happen that seem as if they could be Bigfoot related, and yet there is no visual sign of anything disturbed or anything that seems to indicate that there was actually a physical, Bigfoot there. I know in the Sierra Sounds, when I interviewed Ron Moorhead, he talked about being inside of that little hut up there at the camp and hearing this commotion outside that just wreaked havoc with the campsite. I mean, he just expected to get up the next day and see it all just demolished. Got up the next day and absolutely nothing was moved. So there is some kind of unusual phenomena going on with this sort of thing. Whether that was Bigfoot sounds or with something else, we really don't know. Since you've studied the paranormal quite a bit, what are your thoughts on that?
On the paranormal side of Bigfoot, or the paranormal in general?
Well, but the sounds that seem like as if there's something going on, and then there's no evidence that it actually was happening. The like the campsite being torn up.
I'm not sure what that is. I don't know if they maybe they did rummage through it and they put it back. Perhaps they were doing something in the woods, just simply trying to scare the campers away because they were not wanted there. I My opinion remains that it's biological. I am, however, open to it not being completely biological and being something else that we don't yet understand as well. There's just too many strange things that happen out there. And with, as you said, with all there seems to be two schools of thought, and some people see this, and with people seeing and hearing all these different sounds, everybody can't be wrong. So something's going on. Somehow they're doing it.
Yeah, yeah. More than one person I've interviewed has had that happen. Not so much the campsite being torn apart sounds, but they will see bushes moving, in a wooded area, and just this horrific Bigfoot type sounds, screaming, yelling, howling. It's just a massive amount of movement, and it just looks like they're going to trees coming down, bushes being torn apart, ripped apart, that sort of thing, and then once the incident is over, they go to the site to look, and there is nothing changed. Every tree is in order, every bush is in order, nothing is trampled down. It's just normal. But there's this movement phenomena happening in the woods and this sound phenomena that they're experiencing. So that is very paranormal to me. It seems very odd.
Yeah, I've not experienced the sound phenomenon myself. I would love to experience it one day and really try to get out there and see where it's coming from. I mean, we have no idea what their capabilities are. Perhaps there is some way that they are manipulating things to make that sound. Perhaps they're using something. I mean, we know that, well, we suspect that they tree knocking may be a thing, wood knocking, where they're taking the branches and smacking against trees in some kind of pattern to communicate if that's really what they're doing. We know that sometimes that from Native American legend and folklore that they sometimes whistle to lure people out or to get people away. Perhaps that's a form of communication, or perhaps they're able to produce certain noises and things that are intended to scare away us or whoever or whatever else they're trying to get rid of. And that's just simply a tactic that they use before they become aggressive.
It could very well be. Well, moving back to your research, you do boots on the ground kind of research, and you're looking for evidence, from more of the flesh and blood characteristics of Bigfoot. So what have you found? What experiences have you had since you've been doing that type of research?
I haven't come across another, unfortunately, flesh and blood Sasquatch yet. I, a lot of people, if you read the articles, people say that they make the forts in the woods and things like that. I'm not convinced that that's a thing. If you look at the weather forecast, you can see when a storm's gone through, and the next day there'll be trees tipped over and things like that. Um, I looking out there, I could see where they would be. I can see where other people. So, because I try to go, if somebody else said, "Oh, I saw a Bigfoot there," then that's where I want to go look. And I could see why that most of the time you can see why the Sasquatch would be there. It's dense, it's thick, it's remote, and there's usually some kind of water source. There's plenty of ways for them to go in any direction and not be noticed. Unfortunately, I've never found any footprints myself. I've met other people as I've been out there that come back and they've had casted footprints and things of that nature. But it does seem like, for example, Southern Ohio, we have a lot of sightings there. It is very rural. There's the state parks, national forests. There's all sorts of protected woodlands, thousands and thousands of acres that I completely could see why they would be there. There's plenty of natural resources. It's protected. Humans only venture so far out into the woods. It takes days sometimes to get out part of the way. And then you have to turn around and go back. Whereas they don't have that same restriction. So part of me wonders if they are watching us almost the same way that we're trying to watch them if they're just curious on what we're doing, what our movements are, so they can plan their own migrational patterns. But unfortunately, yeah, I've not come across another one yet, but I haven't given up hope.
Do you think they travel by those waterways? Do you think that's one of their means of getting from one place to another?
It wouldn't surprise me. It would certainly, if they went in the water, it would certainly alleviate some of the evidence as far as footprints and things like that. You wouldn't see them if they were walking through a stream, or I perhaps they could swim. That's actually not something I never thought of, but I would imagine they probably could. I think the waterways are important because if they're biological, they need water just as much as we do. So they probably don't want to move too far from some kind of source of water where it's not accessible to them. I don't think that they would have the means to, I don't think they're walking around with canteens or any kind of means to transport water. So I think water sources and sightings sometimes are tied together, and I think that's wise because they need the water as much as we do. The difference is we can transport it; they can't.
Exactly. And also food sources, are very close at hand, usually with water, deer, fish, all kinds of wildlife around the water sources as well. Yeah.
Well, that and a lot of primates do not necessarily eat meat that much. They'll eat leaves or no, they'll eat other things. So depending on what it is they actually eat, it maybe they eat fish, maybe they eat leaves, maybe they do eat deer. There's different primates. Some are carnivores, some are herbivores, some are not. So it's depending on what it actually eats is probably playing a part into it too. I know I've heard stories from people where they say they found deer that have been torn apart or where the neck has been completely snapped and the head is essentially tore off. So I don't know. I don't know what else could do that. There's no explanation. A human being couldn't do that to a deer. We're not,
Exactly.
it's just not strong enough.
And several of the interviews I have done has talked about seeing them with a deer over their shoulder or something like that, or taking deer out of a truck where a deer hunter may have killed a deer, put it in their truck, and then Bigfoot takes it out of the truck and takes it off wherever. Also, people talking about fishing where they'd have a stringer of fish, and they'd turn around and there's Bigfoot walking off with their fish. So at least some of them, I think, probably do eat some type of deer, fish, whatever, that type of thing. So it's hard to say, but some of them also have been known to, eat peaches and all kinds of fruits. So I think there could be a combination of things perhaps that they eat, and they may have different menus depending upon what the resources are of where they live.
I agree. I think a big part of it depends on what's available. I think they'll eat what they have to, and if they are very much human-like as well as primate, we're meat eaters. It would be safe to say that they are. I know in documentaries that I've watched over the years, when with the deer, people often say that the neck is snapped, which I've always thought was interesting because to me that means they're trying to put the animal out of its misery quickly. They're not trying to hurt it. They're just simply trying to survive. So they're killing it the quickest way possible. And then they're doing whatever it is they need to do to eat it, or they're taking it back to feed others, or yeah, I don't know if they use their skin for something, who knows? But yeah, I would imagine that that's not out of the possibility that they would be eating deer as well as other things. But it also, like I said, it also seems like they are intelligent enough not to want to cause the animal undue pain, which I always thought was very interesting because they are supposedly human like, but still ape at the same time.
Yes. So when you go out and do your research, give me a rundown of kind of what is your approach, how do you prepare? How long do you go? What do you do when you're there? Just give me a rundown of that whole experience that you have if you're on a research trip.
So usually I'll research the area. I'll look for any kind of folklore, any legends. Any sightings, I'll scrape social media, look for stuff, see if anyone's seen anything, sightings of that nature. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a Bigfoot. It could be anything that resembles or something unexplained that could potentially be a Bigfoot that simply people just didn't want to believe what they saw. So I'll start there, try to figure out the time of day that they were seen. I've always been of the opinion that they are not necessarily nocturnal, but I do think that they likely travel more at night unless they need to travel during the day, because it does seem like they want to avoid us, and that is the best way to avoid the human population would be to move at night. So usually when I get my research done, then I get there, I'll set up for the first night wherever I'm going to camp that night. And then I'll just kind of do a lay of the land during the day so I can see everything, get an idea of areas maybe where I can put a trail camera, or areas where it looks like the description of what somebody reported they saw, the area, how they describe the area, things like that, just so I have a visual feeling of it during the day, and then I'll go back at night and walk around and listen, and just kind of looking for Sasquatch is a game of patience. You kind of have to find somewhere, you hunker down for a little bit, you hold still, hope for the best, and then slowly move on. And I'll try to establish a perimeter, and it can be 2 or 3 days, and then I'm out. And then the next day, I'll widen my perimeter, look around more, make notes to myself, uh, just kind of look for any signs that there might have been a Sasquatch. For example, when someone reports a sighting, one of the things I'll look for is, are there any large branches that were snapped off a tree that are high, too high that a human, and too thick, in the event that they're wood knocking or tree knocking, if you will, and communicating that way, just some kind of sign that perhaps they're there. I want to look for the water source too, because I believe that they need the water. So at some point, they're going to have to go back there, just like we drink water every day. I would imagine they do too, especially if they're very similar to us. So, and that's just kind of the start. And then I just work my way out in the perimeter. Will leave something out to record, and then I'll download and go through the recording in the afternoon, make sure I eat, get packed up for the night again, and then go out after I've gone through everything and see if I've actually caught anything unusual. And sometimes you see something move, bushes move, but I can't necessarily say what for sure it was because it wasn't a clear enough picture because it's too dark. But that, if I see that, then I'll try to track that area down and kind of look around with a fine tooth comb to see if I can see signs of something, any footprints to define if it was a coyote or a fox, or if there was literally something else in there that I could be a Sasquatch out there roaming around. Um, then if I encounter anybody else, I'm pretty open. I'll just ask if you guys heard anything weird, said anything weird while you're here. And you'd be surprised. Sometimes people say, yeah, there was some weird noises coming from, wherever. And then I'll say, oh, okay. And take a walk over there, look around and see what I can see. Because if they're hearing weird noises that they can't identify, it's very well could be something that is worth investigating.
Have you ever, I know you said you have not had another, eye to eye Bigfoot sighting, but when you're out there, do you hear any wood knocks, any howls, any whoops, that might indicate there is a population of Bigfoot in the area?
I've heard different howls and things of that nature. I'm not 100% sure if I've heard wood knocks or not. I, I I go back and forth on my opinion on wood knocks. A lot of people have heard it, but I don't know. I kind of wonder sometimes. But I've definitely heard a lot of howling, a lot of strange noises that I can't necessarily identify. But I can't prove or correlate that it is in fact a Sasquatch. It's just a noise. I can't figure out what it is. I don't know if it's a coyote, if it's a wolf, if it's some other kind of animal making a noise. Or even, occasionally you run into hunters out there and somebody's got, one of those I don't remember what they're called, where they use to make animal sounds to try to attract somebody, another animal, whatever they're hunting that day. So I don't know for sure if I've picked up what would be considered a Sasquatch making noise or not, because I can't figure out what it is I'm actually hearing. Just that it's
Exactly.
not something a human would produce.
How about wood structures? Some of those wood structures can get really, really elaborate. And I know a lot of people say, well, those could be created by humans. Kind of depends on how far and remote you are. But, have you run into any of those?
I have not personally run into any that I believe were created by a Sasquatch. I have seen those out there. I do think if you look at the weather patterns, sometimes that can contribute. When was the last big storm go through there? You can kind of look at to see if it was a tree that fell over and a vine grew over and other plants. You kind of look at how it was structured. Could it have been a Sasquatch? Maybe. I know that from talking to other investigators, some people have come across nests before up in Washington State. I have not seen that anywhere. There's a couple documentaries on Tubi that talks about that and Amazon Prime. It's really interesting, but I would not be surprised if they were doing that. They have to live somewhere. They, excuse me, excuse me. I would imagine that they need shelter just like we do.
Yeah,
So
a
it
lot
wouldn't
of
surprise
the
me.
nests that I've heard reported are really interesting. Sometimes they're within bushes. Underneath the bush, there's a large, opening within a bush, a large cluster of bushes that will be flattened down. I just talked to someone yesterday that they said there was a kind of a mudded area in the middle with a Bigfoot footprint inside of that. Now I'd never heard of that before. That was really odd, very different kind of way. But some of the nests can be huge. Those the Olympic project, those are just gigantic nests. And what would need that? What kind of of an animal or whatever would need that size of a nest? But Bigfoot certainly might. Because of their enormous size. Now, that particular type of nest I have not heard of anywhere else that has been found anywhere else. But smaller nest, certainly, I have heard of that.
Well, and the other interesting thing with the Olympic project is it takes them to get to the nest so long. And you can only go by car. You have to go through three gates. Then they have to literally army crawl under a patch of bushes that's almost a mile long. It's almost a day or two just to get to the nest themselves. So that's very remote. So what else would be living out there? You know what I mean? It's certainly not humans. How would you even get there if you didn't? The Olympic project where those nests were discovered by accident. It wasn't. No one was out looking for that specific thing. But what's interesting is when they talk about in the pictures and stuff, when you look at it, all the branches and the things that they use to weave the nest are snapped off from the trees higher than a human would be able to reach.
That's true. Yeah. So those are
And
all really interesting little points of evidence of Bigfoot, whether people are actually having eyes on them or not. There's all kinds of things out there that indicates there's certainly some kind of a living being that is doing some interesting things. What about UFOs and Bigfoot? There's a mild connection between the two. I wouldn't say that in all the interviews I've done, there's a strong connection, but a mild connection. And oftentimes when a person has seen a Bigfoot, they may have also seen a UFO at some point in their lifetime. Two things I would say about that. One is they may be very observant in nature. They may be outdoors people, so they're often outdoors seeing, the sky and such. They're campers or such. So they would be more inclined than, say, a person who lives indoors mostly to see a UFO and a Bigfoot as well. But what are your thoughts on the connection between UFOs and Bigfoot?
I go back and forth on that. However, yeah, I was at Small Town Monster Fest in Canton, Ohio last year, and I met a couple guys from West Virginia who use Geiger counters when they look for Sasquatch. And they for whatever reason were doing something out in the woods and they had a guy encounter. They saw a Sasquatch and they picked up radiation, and then it was vanished. And I, they've had a lot of success in West Virginia coming across evidence and things like that, but they're convinced that there's some kind of radiation signature attached. If that is in fact the case, then that makes me wonder if there is a technological factor. It's certainly not us. So what else or who else could it be if it's not humans? Um, I know I don't think the Sasquatch themselves are any kind of alien creatures, whether they have contact with something not of this world. It's very possible. Perhaps who they're in contact with are the same people who design the portals that they use to travel. Um, Perhaps if I guess with the UFOs, you could almost there's some people that believe they're from another dimension and not necessarily from outer space. And if that's the case, perhaps that's where the Sasquatches are going, or maybe that's where they came from. I don't know. There's some kind of, but there does seem to be some kind of correlation there. You also see a lot of sightings around military bases of Sasquatch, and sometimes UFOs are the same thing, and they say around military bases. So there's some kind of indirect or direct connection there. I just don't know what it is. I've done a lot of research and reading on that, and I don't know what the answer is. There's still so much we don't know about both subjects. We can't replicate the result, I guess. So it makes it hard to determine what the actual connection is. But if you go down the rabbit hole on the portal system, then it would make sense that they have some kind of connection to something not of this world that's taught them how to use that system that already existed, or they are the people who built that system themselves, and for whatever reason they have some kind of connection with the Sasquatches and they know how to communicate with them. Or perhaps if you go down the route of the interdimensional theory, maybe they are from another place and we're just seeing stragglers coming through here, cutting through on their way to wherever they're going next. And this is just a kind of like a rest stop on the highway for them. But it definitely does seem like there is some kind of connection. It's just hard to determine what it is.
Exactly. Well, I've been a UFO researcher since the 90s, and I've only been introduced to the Bigfoot subject matter for a couple of years now. So what I noticed early on in some of the interviews was the correlation of behavior between like alien entities and Bigfoot, the appearing, disappearing, that sort of thing. Certainly not the characteristics of looking at them, but there was some bleed through on their behavior. But as you were talking, it reminded me of Trey Hudson, who has a research area down in Georgia, northern Georgia, where they have been able to capture a portal. They call it a portal. It's a box. It kind of looks like a square box through the infrared visual. Two guys went into it, and like the world completely changed once they went inside this area. First of all, they could not see the guys; they only could see the cube when they went inside, and it became evident that it was something different than the reality that we view, that we see. Again, they think it's some kind of a radiation thing. They believe that the UFOs perhaps have created this portal in this meadow area. But it also, they said, other things can create that too. Even humans, can create portals in some capacity using radiation and such. So it's hard to say exactly what these are created from, but certainly evidence is different. These guys that went in there, they couldn't see the sky anymore. The ground was different underneath them. It was just like this black curtain that they went through. They didn't stand there very long. They both, they came out. Both of them are deceased now. I don't know if it had anything whatsoever to do with their going into the portal. One died of cancer and the other, I think, of heart disease. But still very, very strange. So, if you see a portal like that, you don't want to go in. But you couldn't see this portal with the naked eye. You had to see it through like infrared type of visual. So that was kind of an interesting thought too. Could something that is very human-like create these portals, or is it strictly a UFO type of phenomena creating them?
That's an interesting theory as well. Um, Personally, if I came across a portal, I'd go for it. But it's very possible that their vision works differently than ours. We only see a very limited spectrum of what's really in the world. Perhaps they don't have that same restriction that we do, so they're able to see these things where they are, and that's how they figured out how to use them or access them, is because they can see something we can't.
Well, I do find it interesting that there is a radiation signature where a Bigfoot has been seen. I don't think most people are actually utilizing that. I haven't heard of that much with the researchers.
I haven't either, but it's if that is an accurate assumption, then that gives the portal theory, at least in my opinion, a lot more weight to it, because I guess it depends. Is it the Sasquatch causing the radiation, or is it a side effect of whatever they're doing or wherever they're going? Personally, I would think that it would be a side effect of how they're traveling. I don't see how a biological entity would generate radiation like that you would detect on a Geiger counter.
Yeah, that not that could be measured of as such like that unless they just have an enormous amount of light energy within their being. You know, humans radiate photons, biophotons, but not to the degree that you would be able to measure them by any means with a Geiger counter.
Well, and the other thing too is from doing research on primates can oftentimes tell when something's out of place in the forest. I watched a documentary where the gorillas knew there was a trail camera in the tree. They went up and they were beating their chest, and eventually they went up and tore it down. And the next day, the pack of gorillas, so to speak, was gone. And I've come across that a couple times where they somehow seem to know. And if that's the case, if there's some way that a primate knows, assuming again the Sasquatch on the biological line of being somewhere between us and a chimpanzee, perhaps it also has that ability and it can tell when there's something around. And that's part of the reason they're able to remain so elusive, is they can tell when there's technology coming near them.
Well, most
Whether
technology would emit, I would presume, some form of a little bit of radiation too. You know, something that is mechanical, like they're battery operated, even perhaps in a small quantity. But going back to the Geiger counter thing, you know, in UFO landings where there have been UFOs, that radiation is just a natural part of that too. So that also puts a correlation between the Bigfoot and the possibly UFO thing would be the radiation itself.
yeah, I would think if the portal theory is accurate and that's how they're disappearing, then either it's a natural phenomenon or something created it. And I would be surprised if it's a natural phenomenon, but an advanced race, if they're advanced enough to travel from wherever they come from to get here, they're probably advanced enough to do things that to us would appear like magic, or a portal, for example, might be something that we're talking about they're crossing into a spiritual plane. But if you look at a race of beings that's come from halfway across the galaxy, and they have that level of technology to get here and be undetected, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that their level of understanding of physics would allow them to create some kind of portal system like that. And perhaps that's how they travel as well. But perhaps they travel by ship to get here, and then they put these portals here for them to use while they're here, or these portals go back to wherever they came from so they can come back and forth easier, almost instantaneously. There's so many different directions it goes, but it would make sense if there is some kind of connection, and if a Sasquatch is able to detect technology somehow or sense radiation to know where these things are, perhaps there's something they can see that we can't, just because our visual spectrum is different than theirs. Theirs might be better than ours, and they see something that allows them to find this stuff.
Well, yeah, and when you go take it from that point of view, I mean, even just normal animals, you know, dogs, birds, you know, they have such a different a level of awareness than we have. Their hearing, their smell, their sight, is so different than human. So it would only make sense that, we don't know what Bigfoot's capabilities are, but it would only make sense that they would be different than ours.
Right. And, going camping, sometimes you'll see signs, about making sure your garbage is contained and things like that because a bear can smell trash, a mile away or 2 miles away, whatever it is. Who's to say that their sense of smell isn't that heightened as well? Same thing with their hearing, their vision. So if their senses are much more heightened than ours, that also gives them a definite advantage as far as evading us because they'll know we're coming before we know they're there.
Yeah, they would have maybe a strong sense even miles away. They can have some awareness of various activities or something based on many, many different factors. So we do have to take into consideration, I guess, when investigating these things, that we are so limited on our perception ability that we can't say, 100% something isn't there when we may not be able to see it necessarily.
I've often wondered when they disappear if that's actually what's happening or if they have some natural ability to camouflage into the woods or they are uh, able to manipulate their color somehow or change themselves into a shade that is outside of our visual spectrum, making them appear invisible to us only because we just can't see them because we can't see the color that they've changed for some reason or we can't perceive it. I wonder if there's some kind of evolutionary trait that they've developed almost in a way like a chameleon blends in, if there's some way that they can go into the woods and blend in better with the trees or go into the mountains and blend into a rock face and make it much more difficult to be detected by sight versus if you had like a thermal camera or we could see a heat signature or something like that, but the visual human spectrum would be unlikely to be able to see them, and that's something that's developed for, if you look at how evolution in theory works, they would develop traits that would benefit them. And if humans essentially are the biggest threat, it would make sense, evolutionary speaking, that they would develop traits to either get us before we get them, but we outnumber them. So it would make sense that they would then focus on being elusive as they are now and disappearing and things like that. And that's part of the reason why it seems like they're there 1 second and gone the next. They haven't actually gone anywhere. They've just changed to some kind of spectrum that we're not able to perceive.
I have to agree with you. I think that could very well be a likelihood. Another thing is humans, we are so prone to pick up movement. And if there's no movement, it's really difficult, especially if it doesn't fit into what we're familiar with. We just are going to categorize an image or a blob or something, maybe with the background that's already there.
And we don't know their, really the full limit of their physical capabilities either. It's possible, if they can move, assuming that they're, you're talking 9 feet tall, if they're weighing 400 or 500 pounds or more and they're able to run at that speed, at a high capacity speed, just like humans can, they potentially run faster, jump higher. They might be able to climb significantly fast. I don't know. I think most times when you're looking for a Sasquatch, everyone's looking at the ground. I always look up at the trees just out of curiosity to see if there's anything in there because they have to go somewhere when they disappear. And, whether it's they're, changing their visual cortex or they've just found some other way to adapt. Perhaps it's a combination of both, where they, as you said, they could hold still so well that they just simply blend into the background. Or perhaps they are climbers, maybe they're diggers, maybe they bury themselves a little bit when they, disappear, as people say. There's just so much we don't know about their biological capabilities. It's hard to say what is really causing the disappearance.
Exactly. So on the paranormal end of things, when we first started, you talked about, you'd always had an interest, like say in, ghost or hauntings or other types of paranormal things. What has your research done in that area, that arena?
So it's with the supernatural. I go to haunted places. I stay the night. I do research. I set up, cameras, recorders, that kind of thing. When I was in college at Columbus State in Columbus, Ohio, I had an encounter with something, and it was there was at the time I didn't wasn't quite sure what I had saw, and I was going up to the top floor on one of the buildings for a math class, and there was a woman in a very old fashioned red dress, and she was walking down the hallway. I'm like, that is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. That said, she was also, very pretty. So I kind of walked down there, looked, maybe there's a Renaissance thing or some kind of club going on up here. And it looked like where she had gone. And I turned into the room and there was nobody in there. And a guy came up from the other side of the staircase on the other side of the floor and asked me if I saw where the lady in the red had gone. And I said, no, I thought she went out that way because there's no one in any of these rooms. And he said, no, I saw her on the staircase and she turned around and went back towards you. I never saw her turn around. I saw her, she was gone. And about 6 months later, I got a job working with the school as a student ambassador and giving tours and stuff like that. And during the training, they talked about the lady in red who haunted Aquinas Hall. And that's when I realized what I'd actually seen was the ghost that supposedly haunts that hall. And that kind of solidified the paranormal aspect to me.
Does
Uh,
anyone know who she is?
no, I've tried to figure it out. There's different myths that go around there. There was allegedly where the hall was built, it used to be a cemetery. There was instances in the Columbus State Library as well. It was also built over a cemetery. Some people say it was a cemetery. I found some stuff saying that there was perhaps an old Indian burial ground there, which in Ohio is very likely. And the reports have been going on for years, but no one knows who she is. I've never been able to find any evidence that anyone died at the school or anything like that. But if there was, it's if the cemetery was supposedly where they moved the graves, I guess when they built it. But the question is, did they really move the graves or they just move the headstones? Or did disturbing the grave provoke someone or something to show itself? And for whatever reason, she's anchored to that hall, or perhaps there's an object in that hall that she's anchored to and it has nothing to do with the site at all. There's something else in the building that's perhaps belonged to her, or for some reason she's attached to it. But I've never been able to figure out any leads as far as who her identity is. I would love to love to know that. That would explain a lot of questions.
It would. Any ability to date her based upon how she's dressed?
I would have guessed 1800s based on the dress. Looked to me, it looked kind of almost like a Victorian era or something like that, that you'd have seen someone that was living in an old Victorian house. My best guess was 1800s from just looking at pictures and stuff, but it's hard to say for sure. I know other people that I had met that had seen her. She's always in the red dress. She doesn't take any other form or anything like that. Everyone's description is the same. She's very attractive. She wears a red dress. Some people had seen her looking out of the window on the top floor. Other people had seen her in the hallway, or kind of like I did, where it looks like she either went stairs or a room and just vanished. But the consensus of her appearance has always been the same, and her ability to disappear seems to be the same as well.
Has anyone ever interacted with her, been close enough to her to have any kind of verbal communication or interaction at all?
I did have a coworker named Becky, and her dad was visiting, and she said she walked over to him and he was talking. He was sitting on a bench in front of Aquinas Hall and he was talking. And she said, Dad, who are you talking to? And he said, oh, the lady. She said, what lady? There's no one here. And he looked over and he said, oh, there was a pretty lady right here. She was wearing a red dress. And she told me about that after the fact because she knew I was obsessed with the history of that and things like that. I thought it was fascinating. And
Did you ever ask her what the conversation her dad had with him? Do you know what they said?
he just apparently he looked over and she was sitting there. He said hi. She said hello. He said, started talking about how his daughter goes here. And it sounded like he did most of the talking. And then when Becky walked up, she didn't see anything. And then he looked over and said she was there a second ago, but she's gone now. So I don't know. I mean, she said hello back, so she's capable of communication, at least to some degree. Whether she would go into in-depth detail, I don't know. Some people use, pen boxes or Ouija boards. I'm not necessarily sure how reliable either one of those things are. I have mixed feelings on both of those. But yeah, her dad did most of the talking, but there was a little bit of verbal, just the hello back. But beyond that, there's still nothing to reveal who she is or who she was or why she's there, what she wants. So it remains a mystery till this day.
Has there been any report of her actually physically moving anything or anyone seeing her open a door or, do anything that is physical?
Not that I've ever come across, and I never heard anything like that when I was there. It was always sightings, and then she would disappear. But there was never really any. It didn't seem like she was trying to steer anyone, and it almost more like she was curious, like she was watching what was going on outside.
Have there
Or
been any paranormal groups come in and try to get any kind of recordings, talking to her, get any kind of communication going with her?
I'm not that I'm aware of. There's never been a paranormal group in there. There was an article in the Columbus Dispatch a few years back about it, but beyond that, there hasn't been any paranormal groups that I've ever heard of that have gone in there. I thought about trying to go back there one of these days and see if they would let me spend the night in the building.
Yeah, sometimes when or at least what I hear, I haven't experienced this myself, but sometimes, if you can develop some kind of open communication, you can get a lot of verbal stuff on recordings that you might not have otherwise.
Some people have a lot of success with recordings. Um, I think it kind of depends. It, made depending on what happened, for example, with the lady in red, depending on what happened to her, if she died naturally or if she was in an accident or if she was killed, perhaps she's not as comfortable around men as perhaps she is women. So maybe there's more ability to communicate that way. It does seem like supernatural beings, ghosts, spirits, whatever you like to call them, have some preference. It seems like sometimes they'll find somebody that they like for whatever reason, or perhaps it reminds them of a loved one that's gone or still living, or it reminds them of something from their life, or simple curiosity. They just find someone that they like and they're willing to communicate with that person versus others not so much, and sometimes that gets recorded. It does seem like some of them like to they like the attention. They want to be noticed. They're trying to get something out. It's not always easy to determine what exactly they're trying to tell us. It seems like it comes through in pieces. If you listen to the recordings, it's not necessarily clear, and people try to ask it questions, and you may be able to establish that the person was killed there, or perhaps the person may have been murdered according to what the spirit is communicating. But as far as what their goal is, why are they communicating, why are they there, what are they trying to accomplish, are they stuck in between this world and the next, are they stuck in between some kind of interdimensional portal, are they simply the remnants of someone who was once living and all we're really seeing is just a fragment of someone's consciousness that's trapped in that area for whatever reason. It's a difficult to figure out. And again, it goes back to it's hard to repeat the results of that. When someone gets a recording, somebody else will go in and won't hear anything. So it's hard to replicate it to really figure out to concretely what is exactly the reason they're there. What are they trying to accomplish?
Exactly. That's true. And yeah, lots of different results from places and different results. Maybe some of it's dependent upon the researcher, maybe just the time that it is. But on going back to the woman in the red dress, has anyone ever witnessed her, seen her, and recognized that she was actually a ghost?
I don't know. She looked so real to me. I would not have known that the dresses what gave it away that something was off. If she was wearing everyday clothes, I wouldn't have been able to, I don't think I would have known she was a ghost. And that was the strangest thing. She looked so real, but how she vanished. And then other people seeing the same thing, and the description of her is always the same. It may be in a different part of the building. Sometimes it's out in front of the building, but it's always the same. She's in the red dress. She's there 1 minute, gone the next. Turns the corner and vanishes. But it does seem like she looks like she's alive. She's a real person. But she clearly, she's not. But how she can take that form, I don't necessarily think she's corporeal. She may look like it, but I doubt she is. But ghosts have been known to knock things off of shelves. They open and close doors. They move things around. So whether they do that by somehow becoming corporeal and having an actual physical presence, or if they're using some kind of telekinesis because they're pure energy now, so their minds are not bound by a corporeal form. They have more access to whatever their consciousness is capable of, and that's how they're moving them. I'm not sure what the answer there is.
Exactly. But it does make you question, the people we meet and see, throughout our day, all day, every day, how many of them might possibly be a ghost rather than a real person if we can't even tell the difference.
That is very possible. Every now and again, you walk by somebody, you look and they're gone. Probably just went in somewhere, but you never know. It could have been a ghost. It could be, and that's assuming they aren't ghosts, is what we're seeing. It's possible they're very well something else entirely. You know,
Yeah, and I think you're alluding to like the shape shifting, maybe entities from maybe another dimension or another something might appear physical, like a person, but we really don't know what they are.
yes, I've been reading, doing a lot of research lately about shadow beings, and I don't know if you're familiar with the shadow people or the Hat Man.
Vaguely, yes, I am.
So I back last August, I was in Parkersburg, West Virginia, on Blessenhasset Island in Parkersburg. It's a state park. There's an old. It used to be the Indians had it before the Europeans came and killed everybody. But their graves go back thousands of years on the island. And I was there with another paranormal group, the Marietta Tour Company, and twice a year they're allowed to camp out on the island, and then you can explore. There's an old mansion and there's an old barn, a couple cabins, things like that. And the workers will not stay on the island past 4:30. They won't stay there when it's dark. They all get freaked out. They've all had some kind of encounter, seen something, some kind of shadow creature, something in the shape of a human, but not quite human. It has what appear to be legs and arms and a head, but not necessarily a face. Some people describe glowing eyes. Some people don't really see the eyes, but they'll see long hands, claw like hands, or long, elongated fingers. And I was in the mansion by myself. I don't know, it was probably somewhere around 12, 1 a.m. And there was, you walked in, if you from the front door, if you turn right, there was a study, and through the study was a bedroom. And I was just walking around trying to just get a feel for the place. And I looked over to my right into the bedroom and I saw something. The best way I could describe it, it was as a shadow creature. It was the deepest darkness I've ever seen. It stood out in the dark. It was so just dark, pure black. It almost was like when you looked at it, like your vision was being swallowed up by this thing, like a bottomless pit of just darkness. And it slithered over on the one side of the bed, and then it disappeared. And it appeared to have arms. I didn't see a face or eyes. It had legs from what I could tell. And I don't know what it wanted, because it seems like it may have been watching me when I was in the house. I'm not completely sure. But whatever it was, I saw it go over. And my first instinct was there's an explanation for this. I went outside, did a lap around the house. I couldn't find anyone else. Not a single person was nearby. And eventually I tracked everyone down and kind of got an idea who was where, and no one was in the area. I was completely by myself. Because my original thought was, well, maybe there was somebody with a flashlight or there's some explanation for how this occurred. And I to date can't figure out what it was other than it was a shadow being. And the tour guides there said that they have seen shadow beings on the island before and they can't explain it either.
I've heard of the shadow beings, but I just want to share a quick experience that I had. I used to do a lot of regressions with people, hypnotic regressions, and especially people who had had unusual encounters like UFO abduction potentials, lots of entities and beings in their world. And one day I had scheduled a session for that afternoon with a woman. And earlier that day, I kept seeing in the corner of my living room, because there was like a cutout from my kitchen I could see through to the living room. And over in the corner, I kept getting kind of out of the side of my eye, just something tall, very dark, black, like you said, just a very unusual kind of shadow back there. And I kept thinking, well, is my husband still home? And then of course logic kicks in. It's like, no, 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 he's been gone to work for a long time now. And why would he be standing in the corner of our living room? It just that didn't make sense. But when I would look at it directly, it would be gone. But then several times that morning, I would see it, I would see it, I would see it. And it's like it kept returning. So later that day, when the woman arrived to my house and she came in, the first thing she started talking about was exactly what you were saying. There was this tall, very dark, shadow-like figure with the very same explanation that your description that you have, that would often come over her bed. And it was very, very frightening to her as a child. And as she grew up, and this same character would repeat and come back. So I really thought that this thing had showed up that day just because she was going to be there and I was going to be working with her regarding this particular entity. It didn't come back. I never saw it in my house again. So I don't think it had anything to do with me personally. I think it was just, she was going to be there and it may have accompanied her to my home for the session, or it may have just been an inkling of knowing what we were going to talk about. I'm not sure, but yeah, I think those things exist. I mean, what form they take, where they come from, what they actually are, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they're dangerous or not. I mean, I don't know, but they have been described by many people.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said you saw it out of the corner of your eye, because a lot of the sightings go, people see it out of the side of their eye for some reason. It's not as straight on. I saw it by when I had my encounter, I saw it straight on, but a lot of people see it out of the side or it moves around and they see it out of another side, and that seems to be a common thing, almost like they're watching us. Just not quite in our view, but every now and again, if you turn your head the right way, you catch a glimpse and then they kind of fade away. Oh, and that's one of the things. And I've talked to people that have said they're demonic. I've talked to people that said they're perfectly harmless. They've seen them their entire lives. They just are simply are. They're part of this world and they always have been. They don't know what they are, but that doesn't bother them. It does seem like some people are more sensitive to paranormal activities, shadow beings, things like that than others. I don't know if that's if there's something that's in all of us, whether it's something, something in our brain that some people that part of the brain is more active than others, but for some reason it does seem like some people are more sensitive to see these things more often than other people.
Well, that's another thread that I see running through this. People who see Bigfoot are often the same people, like I said, that see UFO craft, that have alien interaction. They can see ghosts. They often, the shadow people. There's the thread seems to be they seem to be very perceptive of whatever this phenomena is, no matter what form it takes. And then there are other people that just don't see anything. They don't have, they might see a flesh and blood Bigfoot, but they don't see all these other things. And so, how much of it resides in the person's ability to perceive these things, and how much of it resides in what is a reality in that physical world out there that we put so much stock into.
Yeah, I agree. I sometimes wonder if it is some kind of perhaps a recessive gene that some people inherit that makes them more aware to it, or is there a more um, spiritual factor to it? I know I've talked to people who say that they have done Reiki and they become Reiki masters, and that has let them open their minds to see things that they didn't see before. Or in one case, I talked to a lady who said that it allowed her to kind of close off some of the things that she was seeing because she didn't want to see them as much. And that was what led her down that path of taking the Reiki classes, that it had opened her senses to a point where she could control it by shutting it off. And where before it was just the switch was always on.
Yeah, and I know earlier you talked about, thinking that or believing that, all of these things probably have some actual physical explanation. They probably all have a physics explanation. I'd like to clarify that because everything's energy. And of course, the way we perceive our body perceives, reality is just by decoding these energy fields. And we learned, what things are. But there may be a lot of energy fields that we don't know how to decode. We may, come in contact with them, but we have no place in our brain to decode those, so we don't perceive them. Um, Talking about the Reiki person, I mean, I've taught. I'm a Reiki, also a Reiki master, but also taught, energy awareness. And the more you become open to that, the more aware you are of these various types of energy fields that are not just readily available for our five senses, but we can be aware of them if we desire to, and work at becoming more aware of them, becoming more aware of. I know I haven't seen a Bigfoot, I can tell you that, but I haven't looked for them overly hard either. So I haven't seen very much in the way of UFO craft either, but I understand that my mind, the way I work, I'm a real physically oriented person in that I do tend to view the physical world and through my five senses in a very physical format. So I'm probably not going to see them in a physical way that, that you would see a UFO craft or something like that. You might have to be in a little different state. But also each of us have a signature pattern, a signature frequency pattern, but we also, our brain waves operate on different frequency patterns as well. Some people just have a real high frequency ability to perceive things, and other people are just real grounded in a lower frequency, and everything is that physical world that and of course our Western mindset is definitely tied into this physical world of matter, so we're not really taught how to see these other energy fields. Could be the Native Americans had something right there, and they didn't have that Western mindset. They had an ability to see those other energy fields.
Yeah, I do think that we lost something as we developed as a species, as we became more technological and we started to uh, dismiss some of the practices and beliefs of the past. I think our ancestors would not have continued to do practices like for Reiki or energy, things like that, if there wasn't some result. Why would they do it? No, I think it's goes into that area of science and physics that we can't explain how or why it works, but it does. And I think that because we couldn't explain how or why, people dismissed it. And then as a culture, we're all taught that no, that's not possible. No, that's not possible. No, you didn't see that. No, you couldn't have seen that. And part of me thinks that people see more than they realize. They simply consciously or unconsciously block it out. They just don't acknowledge it, in a way they almost like they give themselves a conscious amnesia of a certain event or a certain sliding out of the corner of their eye, just assuming it's not possible because that's what we've all been groomed to believe. We've been told we know it's not possible until you see it, and then that completely changes.
Absolutely. And a lot of people obviously are seeing Bigfoot, they're seeing ghosts, they're seeing UFO craft and alien beings. I mean, it's all a gamut of things that are possible out there for us to interact with if we just open our minds to do so. Brian, I want to thank you for being with me here today and being so open and honest about all the research that you're doing. Keep up the good work. I really, really appreciate it. And I also want to thank my audience for watching the channel. And I would like to ask everyone if you would please like, share, and subscribe. Keep us going. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. It was great talking with you.